Welcome to the fifth day and last day of the 13th meeting of studies on the origins of contemporary philosophy. Today we have a very special guest who is our friend here in the research group, Professor Peter Simons from Trinity College Dublin. He'll present a talk, and then the comments are going to be made by Professor Ernesto Giusti, professor at the University Unicentro. So without further ado, Peter Simons, please, you can begin your talk.
Okay, thank you. Can we get the slides up, please?
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go right back to the beginning. All right. First of all, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak at this conference. I wish I could be in Brazil with you because I love coming, but there are several reasons why I couldn't make it this time, but maybe in the future. I'm going to largely read this paper, but I've got some pictures as well. So I realized listening to other people this week that it's quite good, especially if you are a remote participant, to have something to look at on your screen rather than just me or the speaker's ugly visage. So there are some pictures, but they're not essential. The essential part is the text, which I will start in a minute. I'll just give you a rundown of what I'm going to speak about. Obviously, it's about the Bolzano-Exner correspondence, and I'll say obviously a lot more about that. These are the sections in which I'm going to speak about it. Ignore the fact that the numbers renumber from 1 on the right-hand column. This is just an artifact of the distance between the UK and Brazil. It should go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there are 9 sections. Prologue, Bolzano's semantic Platonism, Exner, mathematical method, the correspondence, then semantic Platonism again, this time critically, grasping, section 7, other topics, section 8, and verdict, section 9. And I shall start just by introducing you to the 2 correspondents, the 2 letter exchanges. The pictures are a little bit out of size, but don't worry, I'll say what's missing. Bolzano is probably he's certainly the better known of the 2 people involved. That's my favorite picture of Bolzano, and those of you who can see me on the screen may notice that there is also a copy of that picture above my right shoulder on the wall. So that is pride of place in my study. Bolzano is my biggest hero in philosophy these days. He was born on the 5th of October, 1781 in Prague, and he died in the same city on the 18th of December, 1848. Those 2 dates are interesting. 1781 was the date of the publication of the first edition of Kant's First Critique, a work which preoccupied Bolzano quite considerably. He had a lot of respect for Kant. He disagreed a lot with Kant, but he did have a lot of respect for him and read him carefully and adopted and adapted some of Kant's terminology. By contrast, he had little or no respect for Kant's German idealist successors, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, as we'll find out. And 1848 is interesting for 2 reasons. One is it was the year of the March Revolution in Prague. There were revolutions all over Central Europe against the established order. The established order had been established or re-established in 1815 after the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. And one of the chief architects of that re-establishment was Fürst Metternich, who was Austrian chancellor for many years. And Metternich imposed a system of rigorous censorship and effectively a police state, which did not tolerate criticism of the established order, which included the church and the state, in particular the emperor. And Bolzano fell foul of that repressive system. It caused him to lose his job and be prosecuted by the church for heresy. He never got his job back, but the prosecution for heresy was eventually dropped because basically he could argue that he was not being heretical in his views, and he could certainly run rings around anybody who was trying to accuse him. He was professor in Prague from 1804, when he was a very young man, to 1819, when he lost his job. He was not professor of philosophy, he was professor of the theory of religion. So that's Bolzano. Exner is much less well known. He is called Franz Serafin Exner. If you Google that name, you will find actually that he does not come up first. The person who comes up is his son, Franz Serafin Exner Jr., who was a notable, quite important physicist in Vienna in the late 19th century. So Franz Serafin Exner Jr. is probably more famous than his father. Exner was born in Vienna in 1802 and died relatively young at the age of 51 of health complications in Padua. He'd gone to Italy to try and get a better climate than in Vienna. And he was professor of philosophy. He was professor of philosophy in Prague from 1831, again at an early age, 29, until 1848. And in 1848, he was called back to Vienna, his birth city, to be part of a commission advising the Minister of Education for Austria on how to reform high schools, gymnasium, and university studies. And his reforms were very important. The Minister of Education, Graf Leo Thun Hohenstein, was in fact a student of his from Prague. So that helped, I think, to get his suggestions for reform put through. Of their works, I've chosen just two for each of them. Bolzano's works are much better known, of course, the Wissenschaftslehre, which was published in 4 volumes in 1837, reissued in the Gesamtausgabe and now in a very good English translation, which I'm hoping will make him more popular. That was the work on which he was working, or basically more or less finished working, when he had his exchange with Exner. And Exner even tried to help him get it published in Leipzig or Berlin, I forget where, unsuccessfully. The other work that's worth mentioning is the Größenlehre, theory of magnitude or theory of quantity, which was Bolzano's unfinished work on mathematics and its foundations. And he'd started working on that very early and had worked on it in various stages. But it remained in manuscript form until bits of it were published in the 1930s. And the Gesamtausgabe, the critical edition, started publishing it in 1975 under the editorship of Jan Berg and Bob van Rootselaar. It's from part of the Größenlehre that was given to Exner in manuscript that the correspondence arose. Of Exner, he certainly didn't publish anything nearly as impressive or as big as Bolzano's work, but there are two things worth mentioning. One is a 2-volume work called Die Psychologie der Hegelschen Lehre, which is very, very critical of Hegel and Hegel's psychology. And it was as a critic of Hegel and follower of Herbart that Exner was known in academic circles in mid-19th century Austria. And the other one is, it's called Entwurf der Grundzüge des öffentlichen Unterrichtswesens in Österreich, which is a sketch, a projected sketch for the reform of schools and universities in Austria. And that was effectively put into operation in the 1850s. And indeed, certain aspects of it remain to this day. So that will do to start. I'm now going to start the paper proper. I recall once hearing the great Bolzano expert Jan Sederstik describe the correspondence between Bolzano and Exner as the first text of modern analytic philosophy. For that reason alone, it's worth looking at it. Two of the problems that have haunted analytic philosophy from that day to this are the problem of representation, what representation consists in, whether mental or semantic or otherwise, and the problem of the objectivity of logic and mathematics. The first of these, the problem of representation, is addressed directly in the correspondence. They do talk about it back and forth. They often manage to misunderstand each other, or rather, Exner often manages to misunderstand or fail to understand Bolzano. Bolzano, I think, has a very clear understanding of Exner. The second part is the background to the major issue in the correspondence. Bolzano's semantic Platonism, this is his theory of non-real but objective ideas and propositions in themselves. And that was Bolzano's basis for addressing the problem of the foundations of logic and mathematics. And it was Exner who was able to read a very compressed version of that in the text that started the correspondence. Now, we're now quite familiar with Bolzano's views and find them relatively easy to understand, whether or not we agree with them. I understand them and disagree with them. It's helped that subsequent thinkers such as Frege and Church have expressed views very similar to those of Bolzano. And Frege, we might remember, was born in 1848, the same year that Bolzano died. These views have been examined in depth and detail in the literature, but this cannot be said of Bolzano's contemporaries, for whom his views were not just novel, but strange and even bizarre. Now, of these contemporaries, none made greater attempts to understand and criticize Bolzano than his Prague contemporary Franz Exner, and their correspondence, which was shared among the intelligentsia of Prague at the time, we could call it semi-public, exhibits a degree of mutual respect despite fundamental disagreement, which is there now and was then very rare in academic exchanges. Academics are not nice to each other generally. But these two guys seem to have been awfully nice to each other and in fact got on well on a personal basis. The account of Bolzano's semantic Platonism to which Exner was exposed was the part of the introduction called Von der mathematischen Lehrart, or mathematical method, you might say, to Bolzano's unfinished magnum opus, the Größenlehre. On the positive side, Exner's criticisms and the replies of Bolzano are both enlightening and instructive, if occasionally confused. On the negative side, both of their criticisms of each other appear to me to be basically correct, and neither's own theory is satisfactory as a solution to either problem. But it can hardly be said that in the subsequent nearly 200 years, a fully satisfactory solution to either problem has clearly emerged. So their exchange continues to be relevant for modern analytic philosophy. And I should stress in advance that I have focused on basically one problem, semantic Platonism, but there are quite a few other problems addressed in the correspondence en passant, and I'll mention one or two of those later. So first of all, Bolzano's semantic Platonism, which is the most familiar part of Bolzano's philosophy. It's been discussed one way or another since the 1950s with works by Bar Hillel and various others. So I'll only recapitulate as much as is needed to understand the questions arising and matters discussed in the correspondence. There is, according to Bolzano, a collection of autonomous entities which are neither physical nor mental, are not in space or time, cannot be said to exist or be, but which are objectively there. Bolzano reserves the terms exist and be for things in time, with the exception of God, whom I'm leaving out of the picture. So these items, these objective propositions and ideas do not exist. But each of them is something, etwas, and not nothing, nichts. So we could say, although it's not really important, we could say they subsist. This is a term used by Russell when discussing Meinong later. And I should stress that unlike Meinong, Bolzano does not believe in things like impossible objects or objects which are incomplete. So he does not have objects completely outside being something. There are similarities, but I think Husserl put his finger on it when he described Bolzano's an sich, his propositions and ideas, as ideal. They're very close to Plato's ideas, which is why I think one can call his view Platonism. Now, principal among these entities are what Bolzano calls Sätze an sich and Vorstellungen an sich. These are not pretty German expressions. They're typically translated as propositions in themselves and ideas in themselves. The locution an sich is clearly taken from Kant, and it is meant to stress their autonomy and independence from mind, experience, thought, and language. But I shall drop the an sich or in themselves locution and just simply speak of propositions and ideas. This is now fairly common in the Bolzano literature. If a spoken or written proposition is meant, I shall call them linguistic propositions. If judgments or other mental propositive acts are meant, I should call them mental propositions. Bolzano and Exner call them subjective propositions. And if mental ideas in the sense of Descartes or Locke are meant, I should call them mental ideas. And if their linguistic counterparts are intended, I should call them linguistic ideas. But I'm not going to discuss those much. A proposition, according to Bolzano, he says he can't define what one is. It's something which is objectively in itself true or false. And this is independently of whether anybody says it, knows it, thinks it, believes it, or disbelieves it, or anything. And as I say, this is not a definition. An idea, Vorstellung, is part of a proposition that's not itself a proposition. So Bolzano has a rough mereology of propositions. They divide into bits. The simplest bits he calls simple ideas, and if you put simple ideas together in the right sort of way, you get a proposition. And sometimes you can have a proposition within a proposition. So when you say something like Hans believes that snow is white, then the proposition that snow is white is part of the proposition that Hans believes that snow is white. So this is all very familiar stuff from later discussion. Just note that Bolzano, like Frege after him, and actually, in fact, like Kant before him, takes the idea of proposition as basic. Kant would say judgment, but we'll say proposition, and defines an idea in terms of, or rather characterizes an idea in terms of its contribution to or being part of a proposition. So he doesn't regard propositions, although he regards them as being put together out of ideas, in terms of understanding what ideas and propositions are. Propositions come first, so they're notionally prior to ideas. When Bolzano wants to make you understand what some undefined term means, he has a very well worked out routine for doing this, giving examples, giving contextual truths involving the notion in question. He calls this a Verständigung. You arrive at a Verständigung or understanding. And I think this is, first of all, I think is absolutely necessary, especially in philosophy. And secondly, Bolzano has a very clear idea about how to make it work. So if you note that propositions are things that are true or false, that they're not real, and that they're independent of thinkers, then you're a good way on to understanding what a proposition is meant to be. And indeed, that was something that Exner did eventually grasp. When a person judges, surmises, or otherwise propositively entertains something, the objective content of their judging is a proposition. When a person asserts, denies, surmises, or doubts something in language, the objective meaning of what they say is a proposition. When a person thinks of something that's not propositional, for instance, a dog, the objective content of their mental idea is an idea in itself, the idea in itself of a dog or dogs. When a person mentions or expresses something in a language which is not propositional, when they say, for instance, dog or its translation into other languages, the objective content of their linguistic idea is an idea in itself. Propositions and ideas thus play crucial roles in both cognitive psychology, judging, etc., and in semantics, meaning. Bolzano says that a person who judges or otherwise entertains something thereby grasps a proposition, and someone who puts this into words expresses the proposition. A person who thinks of something that's not propositional grasps the idea, that is what we may call the content of their mental idea, and someone who puts this into words expresses the idea. By extension, and with some caveats regarding indexicals which I'm ignoring, sentences and terms of language may be said to express propositions and ideas. The similarity between Bolzano's an sich propositions and ideas and the realm of senses in Frege is so evident and has been remarked so often that it barely needs mentioning, despite there being certain technical differences between them. Incidentally, Frege was made aware of this similarity by Alvin Korzelt late in his life, but Frege did not respond to this. He was probably not best pleased to realize that someone had anticipated his views. Bolzano's metaphor of grasping, erfassen, he says, or auffassen, is, apart from the prepositional prefix, the same as that of Frege, who uses the terms fassen and occasionally erfassen. All of these I translate as grasp. Neither thinker explains this epistemologically and semantically crucial term any further, and they both consider it, I think, to be indefinable. Now, every proposition, according to Bolzano, has the same form. It is A has B. A is the subject idea and B is the predicate idea. And notice the copula in this subject predicate sentence is not is, but has, which means that the predicate idea always has to be an abstractum, an abstract idea. There are lots and lots of examples. I'm not going to go through them. I'll just make one or two remarks about the differences between what we might call the logical or semantic form of the proposition and the way it's standardly expressed in this case, English vernacular. The most obvious difference is between a simple sentence like Socrates is mortal and its form, according to Bolzano, Socrates has mortality. And there are lots and lots of variations depending on what kind of sentence you're trying to render into Bolzano's basic form. And I'll just mention a couple of them. When it comes to logic, of course, which is very important for Bolzano, existential sentences and universal sentences are rendered meta-eidetically. They are propositions about ideas or propositions. So I use the standard way of designating ideas and propositions in Bolzano secondary literature by putting expressions for them in square brackets. So to say it's true that God is omniscient is to say the proposition that God has omniscience has truth. So truth is the predicate in that case. To say that there are dogs is to say that the idea dog has objectuality. To say there are no unicorns is to say the idea unicorn has objectlessness, Gegenstandlosigkeit, lovely. And particular propositions are done using term conjunction. A swan which is black has objectuality is the same as some swans are black, and so on. And there's a long, long list of all the different ways in which you can render propositions into the basic A has B form. And although it sounds wacky, you can do an awful lot with that. You have to worry about whether you change the meaning as you do that. But notice the similarity just in the case of existential propositions. There are dogs. This turns out to be a second order proposition about the idea in itself, dog. And this is not a million miles away from Kant's view that existence is not a property, but rather you express existence by saying something about a concept. And Frege's idea that existence is a property of, well, what he calls concepts as well, but basically saying that a concept is exemplified, which is the same as Bolzano's idea that it is objectual, gegenständlich. Okay, so that's enough about the rather weird way in which Bolzano is archaic in his views of subject-predicate propositions. I wonder if he got this from Leibniz. I'd be interested to think about whether he really was so bowled over by Leibniz that he thought he would just do this because Leibniz did it. But we'll think about that another time. Truth is a very straightforward thing in Bolzano. It's basically a disquotational theory, but it's one with an interesting twist. So you'll note that the consequence at the bottom there is that the proposition that snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, which is all we would want or expect of a disquotational but broadly correspondence theory. But because all these other kinds of propositions have to be squeezed into the A has B form, the truth conditions for A has B propositions are not quite so obvious as they seem. So look at the schema at the top. A proposition A has B is true if and only if, firstly, the subject term is objectual, there is an A, and secondly, all the objects which fall under the subject term A have some characteristic, notice the existential quantification there, have some characteristic, Beschaffenheit, which falls under the idea B. So the example I've taken is of course, Tarski's example of snow. Snow is white is true if and only if, firstly, there is snow, that's the existential or existential import requirement. And secondly, every portion of snow has some shade of whiteness. And this is nice because it doesn't mean that every portion of snow has to be exactly similar in its whiteness to every other portion of snow. And that would only be false if A, there were no snow, or B, some portion of snow has no shade of whiteness. For example, if it's black or green or purple or blue. So the truth conditions are a little more complicated than you might think, but they serve to render the analysis rather flexible. Now, ideas may have other ideas as parts. For example, the idea female, I'll use a more Brazilian example, female footballer has the ideas female and footballer as parts. And ideas which have no proper parts are called simple. Bolzano considers it self-evident without proof that there are simple ideas, and that all ideas that are not simple are composed in some way of simple ideas. As examples of simple ideas, he does have some, is something, etwas, has, the copula, non, the term negator, reality, Wirklichkeit, and Ort, soll, sollen. The idea, and interesting, you might think that God is simple, and sure, God is simple, according to Bolzano, but the idea of God is not simple, it's complex, because it can be analyzed or zerlegt, decomposed or defined as an object that has unconditionality. And unconditionality is explained elsewhere. Likewise, the idea 2 cubed, which designates the number 8, can be analyzed as the number that has equality with the number 2 raised to the power of 3. So you can analyze lots and lots of ideas, but eventually you get down to simple ideas, unanalyzable ideas. Now, the idea that there are simple ideas strikes me as firstly plausible and secondly pretty difficult to argue for. The other crucial aspect of ideas is what objects fall under them, and the distinction between ideas' parts and the objects that fall under them, between what we would now call content and object, is something that Exner had a lot of difficulty getting to grips with. But the notion of falling under, although indefinable, is now very, very familiar to us because of Frege. For example, Socrates, the man, falls under the idea philosopher, but he does not fall under the idea dog. Ideas under which something falls are objectual, gegenständlich. Ideas under which nothing falls are empty or objectless, gegenstandlos. The ideas dog, human, and number are objectual, whereas the ideas round, square, largest prime number, golden mountain, and hobbit are objectless, some necessarily, some contingently so. An idea under which two or more objects fall is said by Bolzano to have an extension, Umfang, which is the collection, Inbegriff, of all and only the objects falling under it. For Bolzano, an Inbegriff must have two or more members. So an idea with only one object, a singular idea, like, for instance, the philosopher Socrates, does not have an extension, according to Bolzano. I think this is inconvenient, but that's no problem. Empty ideas have no extension, and I think that's correct. A simple idea is determined by its extension, according to Bolzano. There may be some problems with that. I'll come back. No, I won't. I haven't thought it through. An idea which is both simple and singular is what Bolzano calls an Anschauung, intuition. And he's aware that this use of a Kantian term is very un-Kantian, but he's unrepentant about it. He's happy with his use of the term. Not everyone else was, and I think Exner wasn't. An idea which is neither an intuition nor contains one is called a concept, Begriff, again different from Frege. And it's worth stressing that for Bolzano, false propositions and objectless ideas are just as much bona fide propositions and ideas as true propositions and objectual ideas. And this position encountered much misunderstanding and opposition subsequently, even by such noted admirers of Bolzano as Twardowski. But given Bolzano's general commitment to his Platonic realm, they're perfectly legitimate, indeed sensible positions. To deny either would open the system up to insurmountable difficulties, such as saying that subsisting objects have parts that do not subsist. Now on to Exner. Bolzano is, of course, well known, at least among philosophers, a certain group of philosophers, the Fachleute. But his correspondence partner, Exner, is neither well known nor widely admired, so it's worth giving a little biographical and philosophical background about him. He was born in Vienna to a Prussian Silesian father and a Viennese mother, studied philosophy and law in Austria and Italy, graduated as a lawyer, but went in for philosophy and got his doctorate in philosophy, was appointed ordinarius for philosophy in Prague at 29. And he remained in Prague with minor interruptions until 1848, when he returned to Vienna as Ministerialrat, senior advisor to the education minister Count Leo Thun. He drew up proposals for reforming Austrian schools and universities, one of which still operates today, transferred the two-year Studium Generale, or Philosophische Propedeutik, which was done at university, from the first two provisional years at university to the last 2 years of gymnasium, the 7th and 8th years. And that still obtains today. And what this did was it freed up Austrian university philosophy to concentrate more on research and less on grunt labor routine teaching, and indirectly contributed to the astonishing flourishing of Austrian philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And as I said, one or two general features of Exner's reforms persist to this day. Some of them have been changed since the 1950s, but it's still fundamentally as he proposed. And to the extent that he's remembered at all, and I note that Encyclopedia Britannica, which I have on the shelves behind me, doesn't mention him, and he's not even in the index, although it does mention one of his sons called Zygmunt, who researched on arthropod vision. Anyway, he's remembered as an educational reformer rather than as a philosopher. And I checked the online Austria Forum, which is basically Austria's online proud portrayal of its greatest intellectuals and artists. And this describes him as a professor of philosophy, but mentions only his school reforms. His own philosophy was like that of many in Austria at the time, strongly influenced by that of Johann Friedrich Herbart, 1776 to 1841, generally considered the founder of pedagogy as an academic discipline. Herbart is worthy of at least a paper to himself, so I'll only mention that it's Herbart's views, notable also for their anti-Hegelianism, which were much more favorably received in Austria than in his native Germany, and will for some time in the mid-19th century more or less orthodoxy in Austria, not least because of Exner's school reforms, in fact. Bolzano, whose opinions of most of his philosophical contemporaries was decidedly unflattering, was highly respectful of Herbart while disagreeing with him, and even contemplated asking Herbart to chair a jury judging submitted reviews of Wissenschaftslehre, an enterprise that fell through when Herbart inconveniently died in 1841. Even Bolzano's Herzensjunge Robert Zimmermann underwent a conversion from Bolzano's views to those of Herbart, which is a factor of, in his revision, or as many of us would say, Verschlechtbesserung, untranslatable German word, of his Austrian school textbook of logic, which was initially in 1853 simplified, anonymized Bolzano, but later 1860, second edition onwards, full-on Herbartian, and much worse. And it may also have contributed to Zimmermann's criminal neglect of Bolzano's manuscript of Größenlehre and other mathematical papers, which Bolzano had misguidedly entrusted to Zimmermann for posthumous publication. As we know, a lot of them didn't appear until the 1970s, long after Zimmermann himself was well dead. For our purposes, it suffices to know that Exner's views on ideas, judgments, and representations were basically those of Herbart, and this explains both his disagreement with Bolzano and his difficulty in understanding Bolzano in the first place. Bolzano's semantic Platonism is at the service of his theory of the objectivity of mathematical truth and proof. And like Frege after him, Bolzano deplored the incursion of psychological elements into discussion of the foundations of mathematics. He distinguished between subjective proof, which is the provision of persuasive or convincing grounds for someone's accepting a given mathematical proposition, and objective proof, which is the exposition of objective dependencies among propositions by which the truth of said proposition shall be demonstrated. Uncovering these dependencies, by which we would now say showing the logical consequences of propositions, is a difficult and complex business and can only be put on a firm basis by getting clear about the nature of logical relations and avoiding all extraneous considerations, not just from psychology, but also, for example, from physics. This was the subject matter of Book 2, the Elementarlehre of the Wissenschaftslehre, and it must be considered Bolzano's greatest achievement and contribution to the intellectual glory of mankind. Humanity, so womankind as well. Whereas the Wissenschaftslehre deals with propositions and ideas in length at Book 1, and their logical relations in Book 2, in the introduction to the planned Größenlehre, which Bolzano called von der mathematischen Lehrart, the exposition is much more compressed, which Bolzano admitted to Exner, who'd only read the Lehrart, and this made it harder for his views to be understood. Later, Exner did read at least parts of the Wissenschaftslehre. Now, the correspondence. Exner moved to Prague in 1831, where he soon came into contact with several friends, students, and admirers of Bolzano. The correspondence, of which 30 letters remain. 19 from Bolzano to Exner, 11 from Exner to Bolzano, span the years 1833 to 1844, but only 2 come from that last year. All the other letters are from the years 1833 to 38, and of these, only the first 13 from June 1833 to December 1834 contain important scientific discussion. The remaining letters of the early series are mainly concerned with the ordering and exchange of books. So it's only the early ones that are scientifically interesting. And in fact, in the English translation of the letters, only those scientifically interesting lectures are translated. The tone of the letters is remarkable for its warmth and mutual respect, despite the differences in opinion that remain throughout. Exner starts by saying, "Geehrtester Herr," everything with exclamation marks, as then typical in Austrian correspondence. Bolzano replies with "Geehrtester Herr und Freund." And by the end of 1834, after the two had been able to meet personally, Bolzano wasn't in Prague when Exner arrived, but did move from his summer residence of Tschechobutz to overwinter with his brother Johann in Prague. Bolzano's address had escalated to "Verehrtester Herr, mein schätzbarster Freund." So that makes it sound really, really close and intimate. Although they never used the "du" word, but nobody did in those days, except with family. The letters clearly enjoyed some circulation amongst Prague's intellectuals. After Exner's death in 1853, Robert Zimmermann, in his obituary of Exner, urged their publication, but typically for Zimmermann, did nothing about it. The first publication had to wait until 1965, when they were edited by the ever-industrious Eduard Winter, who had discovered Bolzano's letters in Exner's Nachlass in Vienna in 1930. The definitive critical edition of the correspondence was published in the Bernhard Bolzano Gesamtausgabe in 2017. Here it is. Edited by my friend Edgar Morscher. There's the title page. And partial English and complete French translations have also appeared, and I have the partial English translation here, from which I quote. Now, stumbling block. The primary stumbling block is the status of for Exner is the status of propositions and ideas being independent but non-real. Near the beginning of his first letter, this is what Exner states. I'll read the last bit, which has dropped off. Every truth exists only in the consciousness of an individual, in an individual understanding, nowhere else and in no other way. If one says there are countless truths that man has not yet discovered, I reply, there are no such truths. There are only things and their relations. Truth only comes into being with ideas, and to speak of discovery here is to use a figurative expression. The proposition presupposes someone who proposes, the representation someone who represents. As a consequence, neither can be spoken of in the objective sense without offending against language. That's right near the beginning of the first letter, and speaking for myself, I think he's absolutely right. But Bolzano, of course, disagreed. Now, Exner does allow with Herbart that one might, for logical purposes, abstract from or ignore the psychological context of any particular mental representing or judging. And in that sense, one can speak of the content of a judgment or idea, but then he follows it's wrong to divide ideas, as Bolzano does, into those that have objects and those that don't. Bolzano makes it clear that he distinguishes, like Frege after him, strictly between content and object. When someone thinks of a dog, the idea dog is the mental idea's content, but its objects are all dogs, the extension of the idea. So when I think of something for which the idea is objectless, like a hobbit, as Exner rightly insists, there is a content, the idea itself of a hobbit, but since there are no hobbits, the idea itself is objectless. Exner's confusion over content and object is partly due to his acceptance of Herbart's distinction between psychological and logical content, but Bolzano doesn't help much because he uses the term, Bolzano himself, content, Inhalt, in a non-standard and unhelpful way. Firstly, for Bolzano, only complex ideas have a content, simple idea doesn't. And secondly, the content of a compound idea is merely the collection of all its simple parts. This means that different ideas may have the same content. His example is quadrangle with equal sides and unequal angles versus quadrangle with unequal sides and equal angles, or 3 to the 5th versus 5 cubed. They are ideas with the same content but different objects. Bolzano, of course, is free to use terms as he wants, but no one now would say that the senses of these paired ideas are the same, because senses are given not just by the components but also by the mode of combination. Exner uses content in a way closer to the standard modern understanding, and despite Bolzano's clear statement of what he understands by content, Inhalt, Exner doesn't appear to catch on or deplore or dissent from Bolzano's usage. Bolzano does have a word for what we would call content. It is Stoff, matter. So when I judge that 3 to the 5th is 243, my judgment has the true proposition that 3 to the 5th is 243 as its matter, but its proposition has the same content or Inhalt as the proposition 5 cubed is 243. And since Exner does not always clearly distinguish object from content as matter, this subtlety appears not to have registered with him. Bolzano insists in the correspondence that there are unknown truths, so truths cannot be just dependent on thinkers, but must have an independent subsistence. Now, I think Exner has a comeback on this, and I'm not going to go through it because it'll take too long. But Bolzano does say somewhere, and I've not quite got out of myself or Edgar, where that there are also unthought propositions, that is, propositions that no one ever thinks, with the exception, of course, of God, who thinks everything. What an adherent of Exner's views cannot accept is that there are truths that are in no way represented or entertained by anyone. And Exner's struggle with Bolzano's position, his struggle to understand it, basically, continues throughout the correspondence from start to finish. Sometimes he gets close to understanding Bolzano. There's a letter in November 1834, which starts well, but then drifts off again. For example, when he gets around to endorsing Bolzano's view that there are objective as well as subjective propositions, he interprets this to mean that there is a general concept of proposition, dividing its extension into two species, objective propositions on the one hand and subjective propositions on the other. And Bolzano rightly protests against this, pointing out there's not always a common genus when the same word is used. So for Bolzano, objective propositions are basic, and they're not a genus of a broader, not a species of a broader genus, proposition including subjective propositions. But he's not completely blameless, because he does use the same terms, Satz and Vorstellung, in both a subjective and an objective sense. He's right to criticize Exner, but if he clearly separated the two terminologically, the problem wouldn't have arisen. Now, on to grasping. The Achilles heel of any Platonism is its epistemology. Bolzano's Platonism is no exception. The crux of the epistemological problem is Bolzano's notion of grasping, and at length Exner lights upon it. This is my next quotation from December 1834. I cannot approve when you, although denying existence to objective truths and ideas, nevertheless give them a, might say, ghostly existence. The objective ideas are supposed to be grasped through the subjective. How can the non-existent be grasped by the existent? What is grasping supposed to mean here? Depicted? Then indeed the existent would be something less than the non-existent, as a picture is something less than what it depicts. Now, Bolzano's patient reply is that he doesn't understand grasp literally. It's figurative. So he says, don't demand a definition of the concept I connect with the word grasp. I truly believe it to be simple. I do not believe that it is in itself. Shit, sorry. Don't run out of it. Sorry, I'm having. Can you still see that?
Yes, but your camera is frozen.
Okay. Ah, this is bad. I seem to have a. I'm going to have to go out and come back in again. Sorry, my computer is.
Okay. Perhaps if you shut it off and turn it on.
Yeah.
Wait. Yeah, so a 5 minutes break. Let's hope he comes back. Yeah.
Coffee break.
Hey, Professor.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to do the slides anymore because that's caused my computer. My main computer crashed permanently.
Oh, okay. So,
So
Professor, I can project the slides, and you, like the meme, you say next slide, next slide. Okay.
okay, keep going. Next slide. Next slide. Next next slide.
Yes, that was it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I apologize for that. I'm working on a laptop which obviously has more limitations than my normal machine, which is dead. Died just before the Queen. Right. So the last clause of this, raising concepts or judgments to become something real, is a very ill-advised one. Propositions and ideas are not real and can never become real. I guess it's a figurative expression against. But otherwise, the defense is very feeble because he's just saying, well, it's not absurd. But that something is not absurd doesn't mean it's true. Here is my comparison. Russell once said, suppose the world came into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with memories and other traces, falsely indicating that it's much older. This is not absurd. We don't believe it, but it's not absurd. But it's clearly false, and no one seriously considers it to be true. So just saying something's not absurd is a very weak defense. So while Exner's accusation that propositions and ideas have a sort of ghostly existence is not wholly fair, it's not wholly unfair either. And the epistemological access to propositions and ideas is problematic no matter how it's conceived and described, and calling the operative relationship grasping and insisting that it's simple may be honest, but that's not making it convincing. Exner does make a move in the direction of a kind of depiction or picture theory, and Bolzano rightly resists that. But that doesn't mean that Exner's criticism of Bolzano is itself wrong. There are a couple of comparisons which I'm going to jump over because of lost time. There are a number of other issues over which Exner and Bolzano clash, including the notion of a singular idea, which strikes me as not a very important part of the discussion. Exner finds it hard to understand how an idea, or at least a simple one, can be intrinsically or in itself singular. Singularity may be necessary or built into certain ideas, for example, the idea smallest prime number or Bolzano's concept of God. But intrinsic singularity in simple ideas seems harder to justify. It might be used in, say, things like this and that, sort of Russellian examples. There are other diversions concerning, for example, Bolzano's theory of the freedom of will, the idea of a supreme moral law, and their complete agreement on German idealism. And I do like these two quotes. Exner writes, I read something on Hegel. To my great frustration, I have so far been unable to make anything whatsoever of this man's opinions, nor of those of Schelling or even Fichte. Bolzano writes back, I've not fared a whit better with the writings of Hegel et al. Than you have. Bolzano thought basically that Hegel had a form of cognitive insanity, I think. But he did read later in life, he read a biography of Hegel and said, well, I come to actually appreciate him a little more as a man, even if I think he's crazy. Now, all of those various sideline discussions, which one or two are also worth mentioning, perhaps I'll add to the paper later, are much less important than the discussion on the nature of representation and the question of the existence or not of objective ideas and propositions. So the editor of the critical edition, Edgar Morscher, describes Bolzano's correspondence with Exner as his scientifically most productive and significant, and I agree. While Exner as a thinker was at least 2 ranks below Bolzano in brilliance, he was a fruitful and stimulating correspondent, forcing Bolzano to explain himself more clearly. since his difficulties and misunderstandings do not proceed from a lack of philosophical acuity, but precisely from its possession. And Bolzano was used to either having people who ignored him or who admired him uncritically around him, or basically being an isolated thinker because he was sitting in the countryside with no contact. And he was delighted that Exner was willing to engage with him, try hard to understand, and if necessary, disagree. And as I said, they became for a while close personal friends. Now, on the matter of, there is a later exchange in 1843 in which Bolzano replies to a piece on nominalism and realism by Exner, which had been published, and again pointed out with some clarity what's meant by objective ideas and propositions. And that's worth saying something about. There is also a rather interesting diversion by Exner talking about the meaning of the term being, sein. And he basically says something that I think anyone from John Stuart Mill to Russell and beyond would say, which is that, you know, it has many meanings and it's really just a copula. So we shouldn't read too much into it in Hegelian fashion. So again, that's probably worth mentioning. Let me conclude by saying then that in the matter of semantic Platonism, my sympathies lie wholly with Exner, although I don't think his positive theories are correct. And the nature of mental and linguistic representation and the objectivity of truth are issues with which subsequent analytic philosophy has continued to struggle. The later history of philosophy in Austria, particularly the works of Brentano, Marti, Meinong, Husserl, as well as related streams such as those of Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Eidukewicz, Carnap, and Quine, give testament to the fact that the issues with which Bolzano and Exner were grappling are difficult, complex, yet philosophically crucial. Next slide. Special thanks to Froman Holzburg, who gifted me the copy of the correspondence, on condition I mention them, I think. To my colleague Edgar Morscher on the right. In those days, his hair was whiter than mine. And finally, thank you to you all for listening, despite the interruption in communication. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Peter Simons, for your talk. We'll now go into the comments that Professor Ernesto Giusti will make. So,
well, good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a joy to be here commenting on Professor Simons' presentation again in our annual meeting. I will not really debate Professor Simons' paper, but rather comment on some suggestions and approaches made in his talk to prompt further conversation around those themes, since I largely agree with the diagnostic he makes of what we can call a deadlock situation in contemporary analytical philosophy. I would like to begin, let me press that. And in consequence, I will not dispute the readings of Bolzano and Exner, not the general diagnostic about how their exchange reflects the aporiae present in contemporary philosophy and particularly analytic philosophy. But I wish to present some very general considerations about these shortcomings in the context of what can be taken to be the standard approach in analytic philosophy. This is motivated by the conviction that if the Bolzano-Exner exchange must be seen as the first debate in analytical philosophy, as Professor Simons argued in the Trail of Edgar Morscher, the stalemate at which both philosophers arrive reflects a stalemate in most contemporary analytical philosophy. And that stems not from particular points of view defended in that approach, but with the general task and nature assumed by analytical philosophy, or at least some part of it. Anyone sufficiently engaged in the philosophical literature can see that, as a fact, many debates in contemporary analytical philosophy are enthusiastically embraced, become trendy, resulting in a plethora of publications, rebuttals, and defenses, and all that seems to wane in years or maybe a decade, presenting not solutions, but a recognition of the impasse. Philosophy of mind and philosophical semantics, with their never-ending offering of opposing couplets, internalism, externalism, narrow, wide content, functionalism, quality, etc., 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 are a ripe instance of this state of affairs. When I was an undergraduate, we were all talking about rule following and private language, and now that's all but disappeared, for instance. And the examples could be repeated. In short, it seems that analytical philosophy does not produce results or advancements in our grasp of the world, pun intended, but rather puzzles and paradoxes. See, for instance, Ray Sorensen in 2003 for a defense of this view. Every new concept of dichotomy in analytical philosophy is enthusiastically presented and hotly discussed, then abandoned for the new trend. Then abandoned for the new trend adopted by thesis advisors and editors of journals in the field. I will not touch here the obvious professional and institutional consequences that this situation implies. Having said that, just a moment here. Having said that, I want to address the opposition between Bolzano's Platonism and, for a lack of better term, Exner's representationalism in this context. My first move is to focus on mathematical Platonism and not really semantical Platonism. Although Platonism, now and also in the case of Bolzano, describe a wide array of views with consequences in many fields, the idea and the main focus, the main locus of justification comes from mathematics, and it's there to be found. But, and I hope not being controversial here, Platonism is first and foremost a metaphysical and then an ontological thesis, understanding here metaphysics as the most general theory of being and ontology as the most general theory of beings. It is not an epistemological thesis, since it is interested in what beings exist and not primarily how we get to know such beings. But naturally, it begets the problem of if and how can we know truths about those beings. Restricting us to mathematical Platonism, a consequent philosophy of mathematics must answer not only what are mathematical truths about, but how do we get to know them and, crucially, prove them. And, from the get-go, some distinguishing characters of Platonism seems at odds with standard Western epistemology. If we try to unravel the meaning of the Platonistic commitment in philosophy of mathematics, it could be broken down to at least three different theses. The first one being the existence thesis. Mathematical objects exist. The second one being an abstractness thesis, that is, that mathematical objects are not physical or mental objects, spatial, temporally located, and do not causally interact with us and the world. And third, what we can call the independence thesis, mathematical objects and truth about them are independent of the activity or situation of any rational beings like us, and Leibniz will say also like God. Many non-Platonist philosophers of mathematics would not worry about thesis one, but the abstractness thesis presents some difficulties, and the independence thesis definitely precludes any subject-centered epistemology and, in fact, any epistemological account that revolves around the notion of idea or representation, as are most modern and contemporary epistemologies. Social epistemologies or third-person-centered epistemologies do not seem to fare any better in this account. They have promised to account for the necessity and universality of mathematics, for instance. How could a person or a community, through personal acquaintance or social interaction, ever be in touch with objects and truths that pertain to a completely different realm from theirs, to which they have no access or contact? The idea, or better, the metaphor present in talking of grasping ideas or propositions seems to be one of the culprits for this situation, since it conjures ideas like our mind touching or reaching for something non-spatial temporal. Also, the idea of grasping is tied with an array of epistemic notions that are typical of our modernity, Cartesian, etc., of our modern approach of knowledge. It presupposes a knowing subject who has direct and reliable access to his own ideas, which he gets from either two sources, reason or the senses. This gives rise to many dualities that are common in our epistemological discussions. If our knowledge comes either from reason or the sense, mathematics, for instance, must be considered either empirical or a priori. If it is empirical, it's not universal or necessary, as Kant remarked. And if it is a priori, and its justification is to be found in deduction from basic ideas and assumptions, this leads either to infinite regress in proof or to a starting point like the axioms of the principle of non-contradiction, which cannot itself be proved or further analyzed. I would like to say that a guy named Kant found a way out of those dualities, but since neither Bolzano nor Professor Simons are very fond of our man in Königsberg, I will not pursue this avenue here. But I wish to consider a third possibility in the vein of Trendelenburg commenting on Kant's transcendental aesthetics. Even if the domain of truths, our mind life, and the physical world are three different realms, nothing precludes an harmony, correspondence, or parallelism between them. The growth of our knowledge through a plurality of methods and sources could bridge the explanatory gap and bring those domains closer to one another in a comprehensive worldview, constructed, to borrow Thomas Nagel's image, but not his understanding of it, constructed from nowhere, from nowhere. My contention here is not to defend this parallelism, but rather to point out that many aporiae concerning our mathematical knowledge are created by our epistemic starting points, presupposition, and general approach to knowledge. This approach is foundational for most part, from Plato to Carnap, mentalist, first-person centered, takes knowledge to be analyzable in further simple components like belief and truth, and equates knowing with certainty. Our knowledge must be indefeasible. So, there is no really other option to Bolzano or to anyone who has grown in this epistemological paradigm than talking about grasping fundamental notions and truth. All this must translate into a theory of proof in mathematics, like the one presented at length in the Wissenschaftslehre, for instance. But also, let us consider a very famous case in mathematics, a contemporary case, the so-called four-color theorem. Okay, the four-color theorem states that any map in a plane can be colored using four colors in such a way that regions sharing a common boundary do not share the same color. You just need four colors to color any map. But this theorem could not be proven using traditional logical deduction methods, nor could be verified, of course, in experience. But from 1976 to this day, three different software coded proofs in 76, in 1999, and now and also in 2005 were able to demonstrate the truth of this theorem. Different thinkers have reached different conclusions about the meaning and validity of this proof. But I use it only to show that even in mathematics, there is what we can call a convergence of results using different methods and models. And this convergence of results could be used to maintain both, to defend both that one, There is an objective domain of mathematical truth that we reach by a methodological pluralism, by many ways. And second, that we must not be bound to a subject-centered nor a deduction-only epistemology of mathematics, and that we cannot accept this methodological pluralism about proof that liberates us from some constraints, in particular maybe from some constraints of Platonism. In our present state of affairs, we must then decide between mathematical Platonism and, if we must decide between mathematical Platonism and nominalism, our decision about this ontological thesis would not itself be the result of ontological considerations. Rather, we must appeal to criteria like simplicity or economy in choosing between competing theories. Those are theoretical criteria that decide between competing theories or descriptions of the world, but not between which entities exist or are more fundamental. A tool like Occam's razor could be used to sort entities only if two competing theories are directly comparable to court, plainly. And that is never really the case. Nominalism isn't Platonism with fewer beings, but is really a completely different approach with both advantages and disadvantages in comparison to with its rival theories like Platonism. Maybe, and I'm coming to the end, maybe the lesson that we could take from this and from the discussion between Bolzano and Exner and the results from it is that we should abandon the characterization of analytical philosophy as a philosophical approach that asserts that all our access to reality and the mind is mediated through language and possible only through linguistic investigations as a tool, as Dummett defined analytical philosophy, for instance. Saying it boldly, and that's my main point, my final point. Metaphysics is not philosophy of language or logic, instrumental as those can be in investigating metaphysics and testing its coherence and consistency. Any science, be it physics, botanics, or mathematics, implies a metaphysics, but none of them poses that metaphysics as a result of linguistic choices or uses, but rather as a result of their own investigation. Analytical philosophy seems to be discovering now that our classical, foundational, and normative assessments of knowledge must be taught in a new light and with new fresh instruments, and not to be confused or assimilated just with metaphysic logics of or other fields. And this is my general comment on Professor Simon's talk. As you see, I don't disagree with any conclusion he makes, but I try to point some further elements that are involved in, let's say, the impasse, the deadlock, the aporia we find between Bolzano and Exner and contribute to the debate. Thank you.
So, Professor Simons, do you want to further comment on that?
Yes, please. Thank you. Firstly, thank you, Ernesto. That was, gosh, that was a very, very substantial comment. In fact, it was much more, in many ways, more substantial than what I was talking about. And obviously, we can't do more than scratch the surface of what you were talking about. I'll agree with both your main points. The first main point is that for reasons which we're beginning to understand, some professional, institutional, some may be inherent in the enterprise, analytic philosophy as a social phenomenon results in this strange short half-life of theoretical concerns where theories arise in total excitement and are discussed backwards and forwards and refined and revised. And this tends to go for between 5 and 10 years, and then without the problems being resolved or solved in any way consensually, they just disappear because the latest sexy idea comes along, and all the bright new PhD students of American universities who want tenure start discussing the sexy new idea rather than trying to resolve the problems left over by last decade's sexy idea. And I'm absolutely in agreement with that. And a few years ago, Kevin Mulligan and Barry Smith and I published a paper called "What's Wrong with Contemporary Philosophy," in which we gave a little bit of a both description and diagnosis of that. Now, onto the major substantial point, and it's funny you mentioned the four-color theorem, because just before you mentioned it, you said, I'm going to use an example. I immediately thought, aha, the four-colored theorem, for obvious reasons. The thing about the four-colored theorem is that nobody's proved it, but everyone believes it to be the case, to be true. And the reason is because the way they proved it was to write computer code that did things that no human being could do because they were too complex. With regard to that, I think it's just going to be a matter of fact that increasingly many results in mathematics will not be proved by humans solely in the standard classical way by deriving consequences from assumptions, but with the assistance of machines and machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on. And I think that's something that we're just going to have to get used to. And I think mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics have yet to completely come to terms with the implications of that position. And I just think that that shows that ideas about what constitute mathematics and mathematical proof are not timeless themselves, but undergo a certain historical development, in this case, because of the development of computing machinery. On the question of metaphysics and its supposed dependence on philosophy of language and or philosophy of logic, I couldn't agree more, and have been saying similar things for at least 15 years. And there are one or two people out there who agree with me or have agreed with me, the late Jonathan Lowe, the late David Armstrong, who have said, well, look, you know, metaphysics is its own thing. This is going back to Aristotle. You can't reduce it to anything else. You have to, as it were, take a stand and see how your metaphysical positions fit in with empirical science, common sense, and non-contradiction, and simplicity, and all those other good things that theory is supposed to be about. I won't rise to the bait and think about the synthetic a priori, partly because I don't understand what it is. What I will say finally in agreement is that I do think, as you say, that the sort of Cartesian subject-centered epistemology has run its course, although I think people got there before us. I think late Wittgenstein got there before us, and in his own slightly perverted way, so did Martin Heidegger. So I do think that we should take much greater account of the nature of the objectivity of science and mathematics. Something that actually, let me think about it. Who talked about this? There was, oh God, who was he? It was, I knew him personally as well. Sorry, my memory for names is not as good as it was. I'll get the name presently. Said the important thing about mathematics is not objects, but objectivity. And I sort of agree with that. But then that objectivity is not merely a matter of social agreement. It's a matter of social agreement constrained by the limits of what follows from what. That is deducibility and modelability and all those good things. And just to plug my hero again, as you mentioned, the person who really first got a decent handle on what deducibility or Ableitbarkeit is was Bolzano. And I actually think his theory is better than many that are out there today. So without tipping my hand too much, I would favor a metaphysically deflationary but logically Boltzanian approach to the semantics of mathematics and proof. So, okay, thank you.
I would like to thank you both for the discussion. We'll now open a question sessions. And first and foremost, I would like to know if Professor Thomas Übel or Professor Mark Textor have some questions. Okay. Yeah, you can go, Thomas Übel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for this very fascinating talk about a fascinating thinker who one of these days will understand better than I do now. But I have one question, sort of by way of clarification over your talk. I wasn't quite sure whether I got right what you said there. You expressed reservations or criticisms of Bolzano's ideas of truths in themselves, and I think you sided with Exner on that point. Does that, if that's right, does this criticism extend on your part to that of propositions in themselves, and if not, how do you, as it were, say yes to one and no to the other? Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, just answering it from the point of view of what Bolzano says, all truths in themselves are propositions in themselves. So if you don't think there are truths in themselves, you don't think that half the propositions in themselves exist. And if you've done away with truths, there's not much hope for falsehoods either. So, I mean, the point is you can believe falsehoods with just as much conviction and fervor as you believe truths. You can think about falsehoods in a similar way. And indeed, if we think about what Mark was telling us yesterday about unities, you can be wholly engaged with fictions. You can have ideas of fictions and be totally convinced that you've got objects for them, even if there are no such objects. So you can be cognitively deluded about what there is, and sometimes for very good reasons. So, I mean, my own very extreme position is that Platonist mathematicians are all cognitively deluded about the objects of their science, because there are no such objects. But that doesn't mean that their science is subjective or non-objective or anything like that. And I do think that one can make some progress in talking about mathematical objects by getting clear about what certain kinds of fictions are. So there are, if you like, pure fictions which just come up because somebody thought them up, like hobbits. But then there are what you might call founded fictions. This is a Leibnizian term. And founded fictions would include such things as mathematical objects like numbers and geometrical figures and things like that, because there are instances or approximate instances of themselves in empirical reality. So there are real collections of 5 things like my 5 digits, and there are, real more or less straight lines on the edge of my desk. So you've got founded fictions, you've got pure fictions, and what we need, if you like, is a constructive theory of what thinking about fictions is like and how it helps us to understand and follow things, while you don't necessarily take them metaphysically seriously. And I'm thinking back to one of the Neo-Kantians, namely Hans Weihinger, who wrote a whole book about fictions. Yes. Yeah, die Philosophie des Als Ob.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So you would you then say that propose that Bolzano's propositions in themselves could be considered on the line of founded fictions? Is that the
I think so, yes.
okay.
Because after all, there are, if you like, empirically verifiable facts about how people agree in what they understand.
Right.
So when if you and I agree that Bolzano was Bohemian, then there is something on which we agree, and that is an intersubjective foundation for if
Right.
the proposition that Bolzano was Bohemian. But it's not independent of thinkers the way Bolzano thought it is. It requires presenters and proposers, as Exner said.
Right. Okay. Okay. This reminds me a little bit of a similarity where, at least in amongst the mathematicians in the Vienna Circle, Hans Hahn like to speak of mathematical existence in a sense that that was, so to speak, established by proof or deducibility or something like that. I wonder whether there's a, but anyways, it was another attempt to sort of get at a kind of realism without being metaphysically committed to outrageous entities type sort of thing. Anyway,
To come back on that, yes, thank you. I mean, I guess the parallel you would draw, it might be, apart from whatever historical similarities there are between Hahn and various others. I wouldn't say it brings anything into existence or anything, but we treat things as existent just in order for it to be easy for us to deal with them, and that may be cognitively determined by the nature of the ways in which we think about and talk about things. But to say, well, there is objectivity and agreement, but there ain't objects. That's very similar to Simon Blackburn's view on moral values and moral norms. It's quasi-realism.
Quasi-realism, yes, yes. That's interesting. Okay, thank you. Of course, Hahn was also a student or a reader of Bolzano, so there's a connection there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you for your question, Professor Thomas Hübel. Mark Textor, Professor Mark Textor, do you have a question?
I have a question about material which Peter didn't present. So if you don't want, if it doesn't fit, then I would not ask it. Is that okay if I ask something about the paper? Okay. So in the paper, you float the idea or suggest that you might help Bolzano not by turning into some kind of fictionalism, but by thinking of propositions themselves as introduced by abstraction. And I'm skeptical about this for two reasons. A bit more scene setting. So one reason is there are actually, I mean, Frege in Begriffsschrift tried out the idea to have something like beurteilbare Inhalte as abstracted from judgments. You have judgments which are, let's say, have the same logical power, co-inferential. I think that clashes or makes it very hard to see that the abstracta are the primary bearers of truth. Because you have already judgment, which you take to be equivalent with respect to truth. So you need to take the judgment to be true. If that is true, this is true, and so on. And then you want to say the primary bearers of truth are, certainly for Bolzano and for Frege, the abstracta. There's a kind of tension there. You need first a notion of truth to get another notion of truth going, and then you say, throw away the kind of introductory one. I find that difficult to motivate and difficult to sustain. That's one problem. I think another problem is that if you introduce propositions by abstraction, in Bolzano, they cannot play the kind of fundamental role they are supposed to have. So for Bolzano, that certain judgments are available to you is due to the structure of a proposition. If a proposition contains an intuition, you can only make a posteriori judgments containing it as matter. Now, if you introduce propositions by abstraction, they're basically just equivalent sets of judgments or equivalent sets of sentences. That doesn't tell you anything now. It's not clear that they have structure. It's not clear that why all these explanatory connections should be there. So I think maybe the fictionalism helps, but I'm nervous about doing this by abstraction. It might work for numbers and directions and so on, but I don't know about propositions.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I don't disagree. I mean, what I was doing in the paper, this is a section I didn't read because of the time problem, was suggesting if you're going to make sense of it in any way at all, what grasping was. I was really trying to get a handle on grasping, to get a grasp of grasping, was if you try and understand it in an abstractionist way, that at least gives you something to work with, because you start with judgments and ideas, and you abstract from that and you get something more abstract. And that could explain grasping. But I agree with you that it lays you open to all sorts of modal worries about the nature and primacy of certain kinds of truth bearer. Now, so if that's the best option that's available to someone in explaining grasping, then I think your criticisms are on the money. Basically, that's not good enough. It's just not going to do the job. It's not going to cut the mustard. And so you may as well just give up altogether and go for a different approach. That's also my view.
Okay.
So abstract could not be primary truth bearers on this view, because they're just incapable of connecting both with the things in themselves and with our thoughts in the right kind of way, given the way we understand abstraction. If you regard abstraction as something like Gödelian or Platonic intuition, then that's fine, but that's just mystical. That doesn't help you at all. That's just hand waving. So I agree that abstractionism is not going to work. And so the question then is, well, what are the primary truth bearers? And I have a very old-fashioned view on this, which is basically Husserl's view, which is that they are mental entities. Primary truth bearers are things like judgments and assumptions. Secondary truth bearers, anchored in the intersubjective sociality of language, are utterances and written statements and things like that. And by hand-waving abstraction over that, you arrive at propositions and ideas as founded fictions. But the basic truth bearers are actually inconveniently rather inaccessible to other people than myself, which brings us to the old other minds and understanding problem. But I don't think that's a pseudo problem at all. I think that's something we have to work on, and if need be, by brain scans and empirical research. Is that all right? I mean,
well, I think as far as I can argue now, I think that's all right. I can have another question if you want. Okay, so that's the stuff about using Russell as a kind of close to Exner as a similar objection. Do you remember that in the paper? Russell's peculiar difficulty?
Yeah, that's right. What I said was that you remember in Russell on denoting, who had something like Fregean senses up until 1904, but then found his Gray's elegy argument to get rid of them. So he then has just expressions and their objects. So there's no in between, there's no senses. And I suspect that Exner was heading in a rather similar direction, but I don't know my background Herbart well enough to know whether that's a good interpretation.
So, I mean, I read, years ago I read this Exner stuff. I read him as saying just, it's all, as you say, ghostly entities, don't know what to say about them. Yeah, have something, if you're, maybe you know this already, there's something in Husserl's, Husserl's Palagi review. I read to you what Husserl said, I think it's the same thing there. When he says, wenn wir vor dem wie wohl allen früheren Lesern Bolzanos die Sätze an sich als mythische zwischen Sein und Nichtsein schönen Entitäten erschienen, so war mir now die Sache klar. Now he knows what he has to say. So I think that's right. Allen früheren Lesern Bolzanos, yeah, they're mythical entities between being and non-being. But I think Russell is completely different. Russell thinks, given certain principles, it should be possible to talk directly about a sense when you put it into a denoting concept, a denoting complex, when you put it into a proposition. But if you put it in a proposition, you talk about something else and not the denoting complex. That's a very peculiar puzzle. So there maybe was that kind of stuff, but we can never think and talk about it.
Okay. I mean, the reason I mentioned Russell is that my own interpretation of what Russell achieves on denoting, when arguing against the third realm, is that the third realm is something that is just elusive. It's not something we can get hold of. He's not saying definitely there is no such thing. He's just saying whenever we try to get hold of it, it slips through our semantic fingers.
I completely agree. But that's different from Husserl, Exner, and so on. I think it's between being and non-being. What could that be?
Oh, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, Exner did say, "What is this kind of ghostly existence?" And one has to be sympathetic to that because it is ghostly. These are things that don't interact, but with which we can, if you like, somehow or other, be connected through grasping. And that's just the same problem of mysterious inaccessibility that Russell is talking about in connection with Frege. I mean, Russell has different arguments because he has the Gray's elegy argument, which I think is unnecessarily complicated, but can be simplified and make the point. But even Russell doesn't say this is downright inconsistent. He just says, there are so many difficulties with this, we should try and find another theory. And I think that's right.
Okay.
So thank you for the question, Professor Mark Textor. I would like to know if anyone in the audience has any questions. Okay, so Professor André Leclerc.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. My question is about the way we represent the laws of nature. The title of Bolzano's opus magnum is, after all, Wissenschaftslehre. The way we do formalize or represent laws of nature, since in the new logic of Frege Russell, does not imply existential import. If it is true that for all x, if x is f, then x is also g, does not imply that there are x's, x such that they are both F and G. So I'm just curious to know how Bolzano represent laws of nature. If the way we do it today, a law of inertia, for instance, does not would remain true, even if there wouldn't be any object at rest or moving in constant speed in straight line. So the way Bolzano does it imply or not existential import. That's what my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Just historically speaking, Bolzano, I think, rather sadly, does require existential import for both A and E propositions in the categorical syllogism. And his theory of which moods are valid is actually neither that of Aristotle nor that of Boole and Brentano, which was shown by Edgar Morscher many years ago, back in the 70s. What effect does this have on how you would express laws of nature? Well, if you remember how I gave the truth conditions for universal propositions a la Bolzano, they were conjunctive. They said, first of all, there is an A, and secondly, any A is a B. Well, if that's your basis, how would you express a universal proposition without existential import? Well, the answer is simple. You would do it by a disjunction. You would say, any A is a B if and only if either every A is a B, there being A's, or there is no A. So you just disjoin it, and you'd specifically reject the existential import. Now, I mean, that's a trick, but it's a trick that works logically. Two more comments. First comment is, Bolzano, to my knowledge, and this is not complete, obviously, to my knowledge, says very little about laws of nature in our sense. And the evidence that this is so comes mainly from the second part, the physical part of Paradoxien des Unendlichen. The first part is the bit that everyone talks about, which is his defense of the mathematical infinite. But the second part is an extremely sophisticated physical monadology in the tradition of Kant, I would say, pre-critical Kant. And as Jan Berg points out in his editing of the relevant texts, the way in which Bolzano uses his monads, which are simple atomic substances but physically located with physical powers, the way he describes how things work in nature basically it precludes you from writing any universal laws of nature, because you have to allow for exceptions. It's very unsystematic. What it means is that the general position he adopts is compatible with many different laws of nature, which would be incompatible with one another. Anyway, that's a minor historical point, although I think Bolzano's monadology is interesting in its own right. Coming back to the existential import thing, people always mention that when you look at Bolzano's theory of deducibility, the reason it differs from the modern theory is that if you have an inconsistent set of premises, Bolzano doesn't say that anything follows from them. Whereas on the modern theory, from an inconsistent set of propositions or premises, anything follows. So ex contradictione quod libet. Now, as a matter of fact, I think Bolzano is right on that regard, and the modern theory, the Tarski theory, or post-Tarski theory, is wrong. If you've got an inconsistent set of premises, what you shouldn't do is start inferring anything you like, but stop inferring, because they're inconsistent. And I think this should be written into all good computer programs which use automated deduction. And in fact, as a matter of fact, it is into lots of good modern computer programs which do automated deduction. If they come across contradiction, they don't say, oh, so the moon is made of green cheese. They stop And that's it. And that's Bolzano's view. So although he is very fussy about existential import, he is also very fussy about premises of arguments needing to be consistent. And I think that has positive effects as well as, I mean, it's inconvenient, but it has positive effects. It's algebraically inconvenient, but I think scientifically correct. Thank you.
So, yeah, we have one more question.
Hi, good morning. I didn't know I'd have to come here up front, a little bit pressure, but thank you, Peter, for your talk. It was very enlightening. I just would like to comment a little bit when you mentioned that for Bolzano, proposition itself is that which can be true or false, right? And then you mentioned that that is not a definition by Bolzano. I'd like you to say a little bit more about that, because from the way I see it, I think that's precisely a definition, and I think that that has a very strong parallel with Frege. For instance, when in the beginning of the thought, he gives an argument, just kind of explaining what can be true or false, and then I believe he does that to ensure us that at the end of the day, the extensions of the concept thought and that which can be true or false are exactly the same, and therefore to make us believe that his definition of a thought as that which could be true or false is actually a good definition, because they share the same extension. Why don't you think that Bolzano is doing something like that, for instance?
Okay, I'm not sure I've got a clear answer to this without thinking about it. I mean, certainly for Frege, truth, meaning the true, is not definable. I mean, the simple answer is, I was just effectively quoting what Bolzano says. He says he says you can't define a proposition as that which is true or false, because that which is true or false is a proposition that is true or a proposition that is false, and that would be blatantly circular. And in the definition, I mean, in the truth conditions for propositions, you start with the idea of a proposition. A proposition is true if and only if following conditions obtain, and therefore it is a truth if and only if it is a true proposition. That is, it is a proposition for which these conditions either necessarily or contingently obtain. And for falsehood, mutatis mutandis. I thought you were going to worry about whether there are propositions which are neither true nor false, which Bolzano doesn't believe there are. But now, I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer to your question. My inclination is to say that Bolzano is right on his terms, that you wouldn't be able to define a proposition as that which is true or that which is false. And here's another reason worth considering. Bolzano admits that you can, first of all, he notes quite a few different meanings of the term true. This is in the Wissenschaftslehre, or true or truth. And he singles out, I think, the second one of those as the basic one, namely truth as a true proposition. But he also admits that there are other kinds of truth, for instance, mental truths and linguistic truths. And if they're truths as well, why are we not using them to define what a proposition is, rather than truth or falsity simpliciter? So I'm not convinced it would work to do it that way. Certainly not on Bolzano's terms. It would take us too far afield for me to worry about how to go about defining truth and falsity. But my own view is basically complicated.
So I think Professor Textor wanted to say something.
No, basically, I think Peter has already said it. I mean, I think in order to truth is sort of, is truth applied to many things, and in order to find out the theoretically interesting one, you need already to have a notion of proposition, because to pick out the right meaning of truth, or the basic meaning of truth, so you presuppose proposition to latch on to the pertinent meaning of truth, and then you go from proposition to truth and not the other way around. I think that would be my answer. I don't know whether Peter agrees with that, but in the end, the things you said about the many things which can be true pointed in that direction.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, the worry for a theory like mine, which is that the primary truth bearers are mental, is that you need to give an account. If you're not going to go via propositions, which you don't believe in, you need to give an account of what it is for something mental to be true. And that looks both, first of all, it's not as straightforward as it is for propositions, obviously. And secondly, if you try and do it, if you say, well, you know, if I believe that dogs are carnivorous, then I must have a concept or an idea of a dog and carnivorousness and stuff and predication and all that good stuff going on in my head in such a way that what I think is true. And furthermore, to explain how that is the basic notion of truth, I have to do it without saying, oh, yes, and my idea represents the idea of dog, and my thought that dogs are carnivorous has as its content the proposition that dogs are carnivorous. Oh, and this is true, therefore my thought is true. You just can't do it that way. That's what I call the satellite theory of truth, because you're basically bouncing your idea up to a third world satellite, and it's the satellite that's doing all the basic semantic work. And of course, it's the theory of signal exchange, which is the problem of grasping and the epistemological conundrum we started with.
So I agree. I agree very much. I just think that this satellite theory is exactly what Bolzano and Frege are proposing. I do believe, though, you hit it on a nice point that Bolzano is not very as clear as Frege, let's say, in saying that we don't want to say that our language is like a linguistic sentence is true. Frege wouldn't want to say that. Bolzano says it with a little bit more confidence, let's say, and I think that shows that he doesn't have that theory so clear in his head, that satellite theory, as you mentioned. But I do believe that Frege really hit on something there, and he really holds that theory as something he wants to argue as true, right? So but I think logically, even though psychologically Bolzano doesn't want to say that, I think he's fairly committed to this kind of satellite theory. I don't know. I was just thinking about that, and I just wanted for you to expand a little bit on why you think that was not a definition, since you mentioned that. But thank you very much, and thank you, Mark Texer, as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Okay. So that's it for today, and actually for our online part of the event. I would like, first of all, to thank Professor Peter Simons for joining us, accepting our invitation, and presenting a conference here. I would like to thank Professor Thomas Übel and Professor Mark Textor for joining us here today. And I would like to thank the three of you, and also Professor Brandom and Professor Lydia Payton for giving a talk in our event and accepting our invitation. Thank you, Ernesto Giusti, for participating today. Thank you for all of you who are in YouTube and joined us throughout the event. And that's it for our online part. We'll continue in the afternoon and in the evening. So thank you all.
Can I just say two things? Firstly, thank you very much to Bruno and the organisers for making this work as smoothly as it has worked. And secondly, to express my pleasant surprise that what I thought was just a historical paper, one talking about what was chatted about in the 1830s, turned into a discussion of fundamental problems. I'm really impressed, which shows, I think, that Bolzano and Exner were really down and dirty among the weeds. I think that shows they were doing fundamental stuff there. Thank you.
Good. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
great.
thank you, Bruno.
Thank you, professors.
Organizing. Have a good party tonight.
Bye-bye. Great. Thank you. Yeah, it would be better if you all were here, but no. Yeah, cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.